Okay guys, welcome to the Programming for Strength and Power tutorial. We're going to start off with a podcast style like we did last time because that seemed to work really well, and the early feedback is that the few people that I have spoken to have enjoyed the format, so we'll stick with that. If you have any particular suggestions, feel free to email me on the dstewart@usc.edu.au. Stewart's spelt with an EW, and then we'll try and incorporate anything that seems that it'll work. So we've already filmed a lot of the practical activities, so there's a lot of videos of us showing you how to do the power exercises, but it's very much an introductory. Here's some of the concepts, go forward and do more, because things like Olympic lifting and that need, they're sports in themselves, and they need a lot of coaching and a lot of learning to be able to get to that level to actually coach that to somebody else. So we'll get into it. There's a theoretical side, and then there's a lot of practical to share. So with strength, the main thing with strength is, by definition, it's just the maximum force you can generate. So it's the capacity of the muscle or group of muscles to move a load, essentially. So it has a very high correlation to muscle cross-sectional area. So it's not just volume. So if my arm's long, I'd probably have longer volume or more volume in the biceps than somebody with a shorter arm. It's more the cross-sectional area. So across, if I measured Graham that way, if we have very similar muscle cross-sectional area, we'd be very similar in strength. Gender-wise, the muscle itself, the actin myosin fibers at a cellular level, they will produce very similar levels or almost the same level of force. So the main difference in gender is the actual relative fat-free mass. So an 80 kilo male and an 80 kilo female, generally the male will have more muscle mass. One of the key points I want to put here is that all resistance training will increase strength from a baseline. So if you haven't done any training before, if I give you like a high volume workout, your strength will improve. There'll be neuromuscular adaptation. You will get muscle increases in muscle mass. The type of programming that Graham and I will discuss today is more when you're trying to maximize somebody's strength potential. So you'll see a lot of those sort of cookie cutter programs being sold online, and they've got all the people talking about how amazing they are. If I take you from zero and give you any stimulus, you will be stronger. We can do body weight squats with a beginner and they will be stronger in squats, but they're never going to lift 100, 150 kilos off body weight squats alone. So just think this type of programming is for maximum strength potential. So strength is a highly specific attribute. So if we're working on the squat, we're going to be improving the strength in the squat. That won't necessarily transfer into other similar, like a deadlift. There is some level of generalized strength improvement, but the actual peak level of strength, because it's so neuromuscular, it will mainly just produce gains in the strength in the squat scores. So you have things like muscle architecture will change. So the fiber direction can actually slightly shift over time, so that you become more biomechanical. You've got more biomechanical advantage. You've got increased motor unit recruitment, so your body learns to switch on motor fibers quickly, and this is very much involved in beginner trainers. They'll get those quick results because your body's just learning how to switch on the fibers and do the movement pattern correctly. Motor control, I've sort of mentioned that already, so you're just learning how to put the pattern together. Fiber type is very important in strength, so if you're more on the type 2B end of the category, so you got 60-70% on that side, you're going to definitely be stronger than the guy that's 60-70% over that way, and that's very much genetics. And then joint angles, joint lengths, all that kind of stuff, definitely pure biomechanics and leverage matters there. Power, so power is definitely sort of Graham's area that he knows a lot more about. If we go just purely equations, you've got to remember that it's work divided by time. So if you go back into the head, think about your basic physics. Work is force times distance, and quite often we'll refer to it in the velocity, so we're going into physics. So force applied multiplied by the velocity. So if you're not super clear on that, make sure you go and read some physics and get yourself acquainted with that. Every time I revisit, I have to sit there and look at, force equals mass times acceleration, which is also then multiplied by velocity. So I have to think about it as well. So I'm not expecting you guys to be straight on top of this. Another term that we use, so it's shortened to RFD, it's rate of force development, and that is literally how quickly you can produce force. And we've got a graph that will make that clearer. And power's also got a lot of the non-contractile components that you have to consider, and we will talk more about that as we get into later slides. So that's things like tendons, fascia, even like when we're talking like reflexes, not a stretch reflex. So there's a lot more to it than just muscle. Okay, so rate of force development. I might let Graham try and contribute there so we can try and get this conversation going a little bit.
Yep.
Yeah.
So rate of force development, we're essentially looking at how much force can be expressed in a short period of time. And looking at this graph, if we have two different type of people, they might be able to produce the same amount of force, but if one person can express it in a faster time, that's going to equate to more power. And if we think of someone sprinting or running, the person that can express the force much faster is going to have a faster sprint speed, a higher jump, and greater characteristics for sport, which are much more fast and fast twitch.
So with this graph here, you can see the dotted line here is heavy resistance training. So their absolute strength is higher, but at the 200 milliseconds, so very, very quick, this person here who's explosively trained has produced more force within that 200 milliseconds, even though their absolute power is low. So like in your experience, Graham, have you found the like pure weightlifting, Olympic style weightlifting guys, what do their 1RMs look like? Are they up around powerlifter levels or?
Not so much, probably usually around 70 to 80%, and that's purely the way that they train. For weightlifting, it's incredibly fast and governed by the nervous system a lot more, whereas powerlifting is more that, while there is a big neural factor, it's very well contractile strength and that time under tension.
Yeah.
You'll find that powerlifters are usually more suited to kind of grinding reps out and can move quite slowly and get out of the bottom of these lifts, whereas a weightlifter type who's usually much higher velocity, much lower force, will fail lifts if they don't have the speed to get out. And that's purely at that rate of force development, and how you train dictates that.
I'll just jump in and clear one thing up for the people who aren't well acquainted with the sports of lifting. So weightlifting, when we say that, we're referring to the clean and jerk and the snatch. And just to be confusing, the guys who do bench press, squat and deadlift, they call it powerlifting, but it's not actually power.
It's not very powerful.
It's not a powerful exercise, it's an absolute strength exercise. So we'll stick to the terms that the sports use, but in this shoot, but it's very confusing as a whole. So just have that in the back of your mind if we're talking about bench press and squat sport athletes versus Olympic lifting, weightlifting athletes. So do you find when you are training for weightlifting, how much sort of absolute strength work would you do?
We do a fair bit. It's definitely not as predominant as someone who, if their job was to improve the squat, they would be squatting a lot and squatting heavy, whereas in weightlifting, where we have different goals, being the snatch and clean and jerk, the squat is used more of a tool to complement the snatch and clean and jerk. So, and that is reflected in the loads lifted. Definitely not as heavy, maybe used more for speed characteristics or tendon loading, more so than absolute strength.
Yeah. So how often would you ever hit like 2s and 1s for a front squat? Like max?
For sure. Just probably we're looking at different things. I'm not super concerned if a weightlifter can do a front squat if it takes them 5 seconds to perform it, but if they can do it nice and smooth, one rep, rely on that kind of stretch shortening cycle and tendon properties, more so than grind it out, that's probably going to be more beneficial for them. Yeah,
so we're still hitting heavy weight ranges with 1 to 2 reps, but we ensure that we're maintaining velocity.
Yeah, and we'll see that when we talk about the force velocity curve shortly, is that you want to try and hit all parts of those curves, not focus on one part.
All right, so and then just to finish on this graph, you can see this untrained person here. So their ability to produce absolute force is low and they're pretty slow at 200 milliseconds. So that neural sort of drive stuff that we're talking about with new people, that will definitely improve very rapidly. They'll be able to switch on the fibers quickly.
Yeah, and literature has shown time and time again that this RFD characteristic and the athletes that can summate that force over a shorter amount of time, that is shown to be the defining characteristic in success in sport over and over again.
Yeah, there's very much, this is sport here in this 200 milliseconds. The difference between good people and not so good.
Yeah.
How much you can reduce here.
Not many sports are successfully dictated by slow, short movements. It's always fast, short, snappy. And
change of direction and stuff like that. So yeah, keep this graph in mind when we start talking about testing and stuff like that as well, guys. So this is the force velocity curve. You'll see this a lot throughout your study now. First point is not every athlete looks like this, nice and perfectly, because some will be geared and more trained towards maximal strength, and some will be geared towards velocity, so there will be changes in there. I'll go to the next slide, just so that you can see the sports. Just be aware that the axes just changed then as well, so the last slide had the velocity on the horizontal curve. So if you have a look at the exercises here, we can see like a jump shrug, I'm not going to point, I'll use my arrow, is high velocity, but if the velocity is high, the load is not going to be as high.
Yeah, as we increase force, so say we have a back squat to keep it simple.
Yeah.
If I have an empty bar and I squat that, I can move that extremely fast.
Yeah.
The more load and weight I add to the bar, the slower it's going to become, because force and velocity will always have an inverse relationship. As more force is needed to move a weight, velocity will decrease.
Yeah, and you can see that in the exercises here, guys. So it's important that we, well, depending on the sport, so like highly specific sports like weightlifting, you could maybe sit in like a sort of range,
middle of the curve.
But with something like a rugby league athlete, you're probably going to have to hit the whole curve.
Yeah.
So you've got to be very aware of the characteristics of the sport as well. Whereas somebody like a tennis player probably doesn't need too much high force, but they're going to need a lot of velocity all the time. Yeah. So they could probably hang around the top here.
And good training and good programming usually aims to explore all parts of that curve.
Yeah.
Usually you'll hear coaches say, we want to shift the curve upwards, so all parts of the curve will move. And another one is called surfing the curve, where it's kind of getting expressions of strength and power through all different types of velocity and force.
Yeah. So it'd be more of a, you're going to do the whole curve, but percentage-wise will change. So these guys might sit sort of 60-70% at the sort of velocity end, and these guys might sit 60-70% down the strength end.
And that's, it's going to depend on your athlete. Say if you have a basketball player, a netball player, a soccer player, not going to get them to do a heavy squat super often, whereas their plyos and jumping stuff is going to be much more beneficial. Whereas a weightlifter, a power lifter, they don't need to be doing much plyometrics and jumping. A lot of their stuff is going to be that power, like the weightlifting movements, down to heavy deads, heavy pulls, heavy squats.
And then the other thing I just thought of then was you always could have individualization in the back of your head. So if you have a young athlete who isn't strong, but they are, say, a high-speed sport, like tennis player or something, we do have sort of probably prerequisite strength that we need to get them to. So you may have a few blocks or even up to maybe a couple of years where we're trying to build more absolute strength.
Yeah, I think that's a big caveat to this is, this is very end stage, high training age, more advanced trainers.
Yeah.
A lot of literature has shown that just by improving strength, you will improve power.
Yeah.
If you improve the contractile elements and the firing frequency of the nervous system, power will increase on its own. So if you have a 13-year-old kid who's been training for 6 months, you probably don't need to do plyometrics and power cleans to improve his power.
Yeah.
If you just gave him a little bit of load and got him to express it in different ways, maybe faster, maybe higher force tempos, you will improve his strength, improve the power, all of those kind of things. So we don't need to overcomplicate it too early.
So I think last week I touched on that a little bit when I put out some arbitrary numbers, and this is, I think, very suitable. If we've got somebody who can move a weight of 50, and we can move that up to, they can move a weight of 100, now 50 is easy, so they can do that powerfully.
Yep.
Yeah, they can do it fast. So that's kind of where we're going with that. So it becomes something that used to be slow is now fast, so it's now powerful.
Yep. And strength and power training, I think, is where people start to get a little bit confused and overthink it.
Yeah.
And it's purely a thing of pay attention to your tempos, your rest periods, and how fast they move everything. We'll talk a lot about intent in this shoot, and it's very much about, if you want adaptations at the nervous system, you have to train that way. And for power, that usually means speed and intent and full effort.
Yeah. Okay, so I sort of briefly spoke about this, and you're going to do a lot more of this in biomechanics and functional anatomy, but just be aware that power is very much related to the series elastic component. So that's your tendons. So we need a pre-stretch. Think about it like the bands we have in the gym and how much power is created if we stretch that and they retract. So how much stored kinetic energy at the stretch that we get in the actual contraction when we move. And these guys, the contractile fibers, they actually are being used to create stiffness. So we don't want them to be too lax and then just stretch out easily. They need to be creating stiffness so that this band can give us a lot of that kinetic energy. And it's very much related to the speed of movement. So if you move slowly, that energy will dissipate into heat and won't be used in the movement. So when training for power and speed, be very aware that it's not just actin and myosin contractions happening quickly. It's an elastic band essentially retracting quickly, and the muscle itself controlling the eccentric contraction is giving us stiffness. Any more that you want to talk about there? Or?
No, definitely this is where the speed of movement comes in, not so much just because we're moving fast, but the faster we can get those first few seconds of movement, the quicker we can load up tendons and use that elastic energy to aid in movement and muscle contraction.
Yeah. And you find that's probably got a fair bit of genetic component too, because it's, you see it in young athletes when they're really springy. So whether they've just got more like elastic properties, or maybe they just got like a stronger eccentric contraction. I'm not sure there. I haven't read too much about it. But
you'll find some of the best jumpers, especially if you watch basketball, the guys in like NBL, NBA, the people who have really long tibias, and you'll find that their calf or their gastroc sits quite high up their leg and they have long Achilles. Means they have so much more potential to store that elastic energy, and they're usually the ones that are really springy and effortless jumpers.
So think like kangaroos, hey, like they got the long legs, but there's not much on there.
Exactly. Super long lever, super long tendon to store energy, but probably quite a small muscle belly.
Yeah. Okay. And so the muscle's essentially acting like an anchor point.
Yeah.
Cool. So think back in your head some of the stuff that we were talking about before, but when we're taking on, we're trying to increase strength and power, we need to measure it. So think about our SMART goals. We can't just start doing it and then just say, oh yeah, we've done better. We need to know that we have gotten better. So how are we going to test these attributes? So for strength, traditionally, a lot of people just did 1 rep max tests. You got to remember that creates a lot of fatigue, has an element of danger for injury. So then a lot of people started moving into like a predictive type test, and so there's tables where you can predict if somebody does 10 reps, you can predict their 1 rep max. But like we discussed before, not everybody's power curve looks the same. So somebody's 10 rep max on, like say, a really strong, powerful athlete, it might very much under predict their power. I know in the Titans, when I was working there, we did mainly like 3 rep max testing, and we didn't really do any predictions of that. We're just seeing if they're getting stronger. What do you guys, do you do much repetitions work over there? Or?
For strength, we'll usually do the AMRAPs, probably no less than 5 reps. Especially if you're working with an athlete and you're getting them to do a really heavy load for 1 rep, they're written off for the rest of the week. If you have a powerlifter and their job is to lift something once really heavy, you can deal with that. When we get towards the power stuff, we use more isometric mid-thigh pulls, which we'll talk about, vertical jumps, loaded jumps, and we'll use a gym aware to track velocity, and we can monitor that over time.
Yeah, so from like what we're talking about before, the velocity-based stuff would be
This is
pretty
where
important.
it becomes super important
Yeah.
in power, the velocity, and that essentially is intent.
Right.
How fast you are moving is going to be expressed on that gym aware. We get an exact number to show intent.
Yeah, yeah. And then you got to remember that the Australian sports seasons are quite long. So what are you thinking about testing mid-season with the high rep max stuff?
With high rep max, it's not needed, I wouldn't say. Especially if you're an S&C coach and you're in season, you shouldn't be concerned about getting them stronger or more powerful. This is more about load management, keeping them healthy, keeping them resilient. All your strength and power gains are usually, they're found in the pre-season where you have more time and can afford to have them a little more beaten up.
Yeah.
A lot of the time as an S&C coach, once the season hits or they're in that competition time of their season, it's time for you to take a step back and just keep them healthy.
Yeah, yeah. I think we did, from memory, we did a strength test when we had a bye week. So they'd recover from that game, and then we'd do maybe a 3 RM there so that we could see who was detraining.
Yeah.
But yeah, like it's very strategic.
And that testing is less about like, oh, have they gotten stronger? It's more of where are they?
Yeah.
And in season, we're looking more at the neuromuscular side of their power. We want to check their fatigue levels and their recovery levels, and that's where we can use vertical jumps, force platforms, and isometric mid-thigh pulls, because that gives us an expression of the neuromuscular system. And there's a lot of research showing that training load and vertical jump scores are very tightly coupled. Once training load gets really high and athletes are starting to get beat up, vertical jump will drop straight away, or like within the day, purely because that's an expression of neuromuscular readiness. So it's a very important tool for monitoring fatigue.
So do you guys just do that on the Vertec, or are you using platforms and looking at the rate of force development?
So depending on what gym we're based out of, we'll have a Vertec. We have a digital version of the Vertec, or we can use force platforms. They're all pretty accessible.
Yeah, yeah. So if you're not clear on that, guys, if we look at their force characteristics or their performance, if that's decreasing, we know that there's some decrease in neural drive, some fatigue, some strength loss potentially.
Yep, for sure.
So that's so we've sort of covered a fair bit of that stuff. The only one we didn't hit here is grip strength is very correlated to just overall strength. So if somebody's got a very high strength grip strength test, there's been a few studies that show that they're usually generally pretty strong in everything else. Which is interesting because, like we were saying before, that it's a very specific trait. But I guess, you know, if you're deadlifting, your strength's getting stronger. If you're doing rows, your strength's getting stronger. So it is actually a pretty good predictor of overall strength.
Yeah, I agree.
The other thing we were discussing is you can do like your wind gates and your ergometry type tests where we can actually see your force profile in a much safer environment.
A 6 seconds max wattage on a bike is becoming quite popular, and it's kind of used as well as a vertical jump, just because it's a different expression. A vertical jump can be very skill based. If someone doesn't know how to jump or know how to really load up that elastic energy, their scores might be all over the place. Whereas it's very simple to get someone to sit on a bike and say, you've got 6 seconds to go as hard as you can and get that wattage through the roof. There's not much of a learning curve there.
They're unlikely to injure themselves on a bike. And so it's interesting what you can pull out of a bike, even though it's not a specific test to most athletes. It's still interesting the profile that you can see from the development of force there.
And because this is all governed from the nervous system, that's how that works. It doesn't, a lot of the time it doesn't really matter what the task is to look at neuromuscular readiness and power, because it's governed by the nervous system, how fast it wants to fire and how fast it wants to recruit muscle fibers.
Okay, so some of the important factors for an athlete's ability to produce power. There's a definite, again, pure biomechanics, there's definite leverage, limb length advantages. So in general, tall people, well not tall people essentially, longer levered people can jump higher. Shorter levered people will express more absolute strength. Cross-sectional area to discuss, so that you know how many fibers are within that area. Fiber type is huge. Sometimes you're blessed and you get lots of fast twitch fibers. Fast twitch fibers contract quicker, they're bigger, can produce more force. they're not very good in endurance. I think you guys will cover this more and more in exercise physiology. Motor control, so there is definitely a learning component. So whenever you're coaching people, give them the time to learn. I found when coaching people, for some reason with strength training, they expect to be good at it straight away. So if I was teaching them like, some skills, soccer stuff, they wouldn't expect to be good. But if they can't do a dumbbell press straight away, they get frustrated. So be aware that happens. Because it doesn't look complicated, but they get wobbly and their arms will fall and stuff. So it has a training component. Training age, so if somebody's been lifting longer, they'll definitely be able to produce more absolute power, more strength. Absolute strength and more power. Strength to weight / power ratios, so power to weight ratios, strength to weight ratios. These are important factors in different sports. Unless some sports you need to produce absolute forces. So say like a front row in American football, they need to be quite strong absolute strength. But quite often it's got a lot more to do with your power to weight ratio and how fast you can change direction. So you need to be strong for your size more than actually being able to deadlift 300-400 kilos. Genetics, I think I discussed this a little last week. There are non-responders. So some people, we can give them power training and their power just won't improve much. So be very aware of that. Have you come across that?
Not a whole lot, but it's definitely something to consider depending on the population you're working with. If you're working with someone with less neural drive, maybe it be the elderly or disabled, there are going to be caveats to that. They might not be able to develop their motor system as fast as you would like them to.
Yeah. I found, Graham's working more with athletes now, so the guys he gets is probably already on that genetic spectrum.
Yep.
Whereas I've had guys where I've lifted weights 2-3 times a week with them and they don't look very different. So, and then, they're looking at you, why am I not getting money? Or why am I not getting results and I'm paying you all this money? And then skill's important, especially the weightlifting sports and that, so that it requires a lot of skill.
Yeah.
Let's move on. Adaptations. I might let Graham talk about this, sort of the early stuff on this.
So a lot of adaptations from power training specifically come from the nervous system. Like I said earlier, it pretty well governs all of our movement about how fast we do it, how quickly we recruit fibers and in what order we recruit fibers. So the first one will be that neural speed and firing frequency, and that's how fast the nervous system will send a message to contract or continue contracting. The second one would be that Henneman size principle, where we recruit from smallest to larger fibers. And the more that we do power training, or the more that we express on all parts of the curve, the better we become at recruiting those larger group fibers faster. And then the last one would be synchronization and motor patterning. The more time that we spend practicing a pattern, the better our nervous system becomes at decreasing antagonist muscles, so creating a more fluid movement. Motor patterning being the nervous system can recognize jumping and better coordinate contraction at the calf, the hip flexor, the hip extensor, the glute, and these movements become more of a summation of forces from different muscle groups, especially in triple extension. Yeah. It's very much a skill, and that takes practice and recognition from the nervous system to know how to recruit.
I found it takes a lot to, talking about that summation, actually just teaching people how to transfer force or energy from the legs to their upper body.
Yep.
So you'll see this sort of, they'll do the squat, stop, and then press, and they lose that energy. So even just that coordination there to express power in the upper body, you need that summation through the legs all the way to the hands.
Yeah.
This is very important. You think about like throwing, for example, that has to come all the way from the legs through the torso into the arms. If somebody can't link that, they're going to lose a lot of power.
Yeah, you can be as strong and powerful as you like at the muscle. Say your actin-myosin relationships are fantastic and you have huge cross-sectional area, but if the nervous system cannot coordinate the movement and fire fast enough, it doesn't matter.
Yeah. So sport specificity, functional movement, that's where that sort of stuff goes. I know the term functional movement's been hijacked by some other weird and wonderful stuff, but you very much need to train in that sense that we're creating summation of multiple muscles in one. You'll get muscle hypertrophy. So we've got eccentric loading. Depending on your rep range, you get volume. We get muscle damage, metabolic, strain. So we're going to get increases in muscle, and you definitely need hypertrophy to realize your maximum strength and also your maximum power. So you can be strong for your size, but if you want to reach that 100% strongest, most powerful you could ever be, you'll need to maximize your muscle hypertrophy. Size does equal some level of strength and power. Remember, it's not a 100% ratio, but it's very, very correlated. Shift in fiber type characteristics, so you will get, depending on your training, it'll move to a more, if you do conditioning and stuff, it'll get a little bit more aerobic. If you do more this kind of stuff, you'll get more speed, rate of ability to pull creatine and ATP for your energy, all that stuff speeds up. Rate of force development, that's one that we've already looked at that on the graph. Remember, if we can produce, say we can only produce 100, but if we can get to 80 within 200 milliseconds, that's much better than if we can produce 150, but we can only get to 60 in 200 milliseconds if our sport is anything but powerlifting. Right? Remember, powerlifting is our slow lifts. Decrease, so Graham sort of mentioned this stuff, the reflexive stuff. So we have a decrease in antagonist contraction. So if I'm contracting in my quads, my hammies learn to relax under that load. And then we also can improve the use of the stretch reflex. So there's a lot of things going on when we do this type of training. So recovery, this is the key part you guys need to understand in programming. So is the recovery of the energy system, which is predominantly the ATP creatine, phosphocreatine system. You'll hear me say CP a couple of times. That's from 2005 when I did my diploma of fitness. I learned it as the ATP CP system, but it's very much in the literature these days, ATP PCR system. So forgive me if you hear me say it the other way around. It recovers rapidly at the start and then slows down. So you'll see like this curve like that. So within 30 seconds, you can be 50% recovered, but it'll take 3 to 5 minutes and sometimes longer to be fully recovered. These exercises are very much reliant on neural drive and the ATP phosphocreatine system. So we have passive long rests to produce, if our goal is to improve power, rate of force development, maximum strength. So generally we're looking at work to rest ratios of about 1 to 6. Yeah. That can shift, don't get regimented in it.
That would be a minimum.
Yeah. So, you can shift it out longer if you're going to be lifting heavier stuff, but I'd be sitting at that 1 to 6 as a minimum.
Yeah, and just because your client isn't blowing doesn't mean they don't need the recovery time. This is very much neural, and neural fatigue, usually you don't feel it until after the fact. We filmed all these exercises yesterday and I am cooked. Yeah,
and he was buggered. So that's that, you'll feel that, you just feel overall fatigue after strength and power days. You don't necessarily feel sore.
And it's not muscular, it's just fogginess. The brain is just not quite ready to perform tasks.
Yeah.
And it's your job as the trainer to kind of recognize that and really put a throttle on how much wants to be done, especially because plyometric and jumping exercises are really fun.
Yeah.
And you want to do lots and lots and lots of it, but it adds up really quick and it's highly taxing.
Yeah.
Not necessarily in the session, but 2 days after. It definitely takes its toll.
So as a coach, I generally just looked for decrease in performance. Is that sort of what you're generally looking for when you coach that?
For sure. And then that's where that velocity stuff becomes really important. If we have velocity tools where I can see where they're starting to kind of fall off that slope, it's time to go away. And then in team settings, that's where the vertical jump testing, say weekly or 6-second bike wattage testing, is so important, because I can see that their neuromuscular system is really fatigued because we're doing too many of these highly powerful efforts. So we need to pull back the volume or the load.
And so the physiology of neural fatigue is a little bit beyond my area of knowledge, but I know that it's the energy system for the nerve itself gets fatigued and it needs to recover. you get leakage of like potassium and sodium, is it?
Yeah.
Yeah, potassium and sodium. So you've got a few accumulated things over time. You'd have to read into a bit of neurology, guys, if you're going to get super interested in that. But just at the level of coaching, you just have to be aware that it happens. So you'll get this decreased ability in the maximum voluntary contraction, and we can measure that. And it does accumulate over time. It's very much related to the dose.
Yep.
Anything else there we need to?
No, I don't think so.
Yeah. So just always strength and power. It's highly specific, energy system related, and it needs to recover. It takes longer to recover. So it's a quality over quantity attribute and type of training. So reading through the literature, the most important thing, or when we're programming, is the most important thing is the thing we program first. So if I'm trying to improve Graham's vertical jump, we're going to do vertical jumps. That's going to be your number one exercise. He's going to be the freshest so that he can get all those things that we've discussed, changes in his neural system, motor control, summation, all that kind of stuff. So you need to be fresh for that, because once we're fatigued, you start getting changes in movement pattern, and compensations is the word I'm looking for. So we're always looking for positive transfer into the sport. Longer rest periods, we've discussed that. We have to be very aware of our force velocity characteristics of the exercise. So is it high velocity, low force, or are we doing high force, low velocity, or are we in between? What does our athlete need? How much of this part of the spectrum have we been on? So we need to program it and be strategic over time.
Does our program explore as many parts of that curve as needed or as possible?
Yeah.
Or are we spending a whole macro cycle focusing on one part of the curve?
Yeah. The stuff we discussed last week, so reps, how many you're going to do, the speed of the reps, the tempo, so is the eccentric phase going to be slow, and then we're going to explode out. So we'd be aiming for more strength gains if we're doing something like that. The time of the session, time of the actual set, the reps. Rest, are we going to do an active or passive rest? Or can we use fillers? And then a big one is concurrent training. So concurrent training is trying to build somebody's endurance at the same time as somebody's power. So from my reading, pretty much endurance athletes benefit from power training. Pure power athletes, they get negative transfer from doing endurance-based training. Is that what you found too, Graham?
Yeah, and it's always going to be that juggling act. There's going to be some component of the aerobic system that's going to be beneficial to power athletes, where it's going to help them to replenish the muscle for repeat activities.
Yeah.
But it gets to a point where if we're trying to recover from endurance training on top of our power training, we're doing too much.
Yeah. So you'd never program somebody to be out doing 10, 15K runs whilst trying to improve their maximum power.
Yeah, whereas maybe 10 to 15 minutes on a stationary bike at 65%, something just steady state to improve that aerobic capacity, not such a bad thing.
Not as much of a detriment. And that's where you're seeing the rise in the sort of last 10, 15 years of high intensity interval training. Again, it's been bastardized in the private industry, and repeated sprintability training. So that's where you'll do like a 6-second sprint with like 24 seconds off. So we're driving that, trying to improve their ability to replenish ATP, creatine, and then neuromuscular recovery. And we're going to do a tutorial on that type of training as well. Periodization, this is just a brief slide. There's a lot of different models, and there's some that are popular that may not necessarily be the most efficient, but we can't argue with results sometimes as well. So for the strength power sports, most people have moved more into like an undulating program. So whether it's a weekly or daily undulation, so that means that we're shifting from strength to power, or weekly, and they sort of moved. If you think about last week when we were talking about linear program, if we did a block of hypertrophy, then a block of strength, and then a block of power, these guys haven't done a powerful lift for like 8 weeks at a minimum, but their sport is powerful lifts. So it'd be like being a rugby athlete and not training rugby, you've just been lifting weights. So that was the move to like this undulating periodization where we might do some heavy reps one week and then the next week might be fast and then back to heavy weeks. So that's the periodization. Or some guys do it daily, so it'll be heavy on Monday, light and fast Tuesday. There's a lot of different methods of that. Any more that you want to sort of talk about there? Or?
No, there's no right and wrong answer. I would say that maybe linear for strength and power training isn't perfect.
Yeah.
By the time you get to that steep end of the curve, you're going to have lost a lot of what you did earlier. I personally will use like a weekly undulating style model.
Yeah.
So say if I'm considering a hinge and a squat, maybe on day one I'll do a heavy hinge and a power squat, and then on the second day I'll flip them.
Yeah.
I'll do a power hinge and a heavy squat.
Yeah.
So that way I'm expressing both ends of the curve in both the lifts that I want to improve.
Yeah. Yeah. I sort of used to do that, but it'd be like a Monday, the first one that you said, and the Thursday, the second one. And then I might do upper body on the other days. So that was when I was doing 4 sessions a week. So it depends who you're talking about as well.
And there's no right and wrong answer. If it gets results and it's safe and efficient, try it.
Yeah. So if you're going to get, I put these guys in here for you just to explore some popular ones. Not necessarily saying they're the best for athletes, but they're like these guys have definitely got really good results. But this is more of a take this and go read. There's lots of good literature, even just on online about if you're searching about undulating periodization, you're finding reasonably good content just on people's websites because you've sort of moved away from that bodybuilding.com. Let's just lift weights. You got some more scientific minds. There's Science of Strength. Who else is out there?
Science of Sport.
Science of Sport. There's a few good pages out there. So this is more of a take this, guys. Get excited. Do some reading. The founder of the whole periodization in sport is sort of more like your Tudor Bomper type people to read about. So maybe start there, read about what he has to say, and then move down the history of, or move forward in history, I should say.
Yeah, I will say be careful if you're doing research into strength training and you're looking at people like Wendler and Westside Barbell and Conjugate Systems, people like Ivan Shako who have really great systems for strength training for powerlifters, weightlifters, people that want to improve the squat, bench, deadlift, and actual lifts.
Yeah.
But using that for an athlete, I would say 90% of the time is a definite no-no.
Yeah.
If you have an athlete in the gym doing 5 to 6 triples on a deadlift at, upwards of 85, 90%, they're not going to be able to perform at the level they need to perform for the rest of the week. So strength training for strength, because that's our only goal, and strength training for athletes to improve their sport look very different.
And I think I probably didn't mention it before, these are very much powerlifting. So that's your deadlift, bench press, squat.
And the principles are the same. We want to express at different ends of the curve. We need a certain amount of volume and we need to be lifting at a certain intensity to elicit responses at the muscle or the nervous system, but usually the volume is much less. Unless we're in the off season and I can afford to have someone beat up for a couple of days, but usually towards the start of season, in season, we're pulling right back and we need to be very conservative because our first job is to do no harm and keep athletes safe, and putting all of this volume in just to improve their lifts and then having them hurt on field or in sport is a sure way to make yourself look bad.
All right, so moving on. So just some ideas behind periodization. We'll get onto this a bit quicker, guys. So strength, we'll be moving from lighter to heavier in peak type weeks. Speed, we're going to move from heavy to faster. Acceleration to top end speed. Power is going to go from slower contact times to faster contact times, and you'll see that in the plyometrics section. And we'll go from heavier to faster as well. So that'll be over time in your macro cycle, getting closer to your actual event. And that gets more complicated in team sports where you have a weekly event. In Australia, it's like 24 weeks, but yeah. Okay, so Olympic lifting. We do behind this, the slides, we're going to talk a lot about the actual implementation of Olympic lifting. Essentially, and this is very much Graham's realm, but it's a very complicated sport.
I think it's one of the most complex sports in the world when you look at the actual technique and how many degrees of freedom there are in movement for actual success. It's considered one of the most technical movements in all of sport.
Yeah, it's very much a power sport, but it's also very much a technique sport. Because you see the athletes; they're not necessarily huge. They're just very powerful and very, very efficient and technical. Yeah. So knowing that it's very complicated and it's highly skilled, we start to question. It's very popular for strength coaches to program it, but the question is, how long does it take for us to get transfer into our sport, because it takes so long to learn it? And we're going to give you some. We're going to talk about this more, but we're going to give you examples of how to get results quicker without having to learn the clean and jerk. So you've also got derivatives from the clean and jerk. So you take just components, also clean and jerk and the snatch, take components out and just make smaller movement patterns, which are quite valuable. Do you use those a lot? Or?
I use them sometimes. They're probably lesser evil than the full lifts, but still quite complex. The main problem I have with Olympic weightlifting is because they're so complex and heavy movements, it can take so long for your client or athlete to become technically proficient, and then on top of that have kind of the confidence to really move a weight like that. A lot of these weightlifting movements, you're expected to move really fast, put weight over your head, catch weight in the bottom of a squat, all of these kind of things. And it can take a long time for someone to be mentally ready to do that.
Yeah.
And until that time, they're going to be moving sub-maximal weight where they're not really getting the stimulus from, purely because they're hesitant to move those heavier loads.
Yeah.
Whereas I can give you an alternative that doesn't involve a barbell or throwing a weight over your head, and you're less hesitant. I can get velocity and intent and get neural adaptation straight away, possibly 6 months to a year quicker than I would if I invested time in Olympic weightlifting.
Yeah. So we're not creating, most of the times we're not creating weightlifters. We're trying to create powerful people.
Weightlifting is very much an investment, and it's up to you to decide whether it's a worthy investment. I would argue most of the time it isn't.
What about, say you got a young athlete, you can explore it then, maybe if they're 14?
Yeah, it's not a bad thing to look at with an athlete. I would definitely make sure that they have some sort of base. They should be able to hinge and squat and have some sort of loading and tendon health before you start exploring lifts.
Yeah.
When you have a long-term athlete and they don't need to be super successful, super performance orientated straight away, that's an avenue you can go down, because it might get to a point where they're in their late teens and they're an adult and they need to improve their power. They have the full lifts in their skill set where they can be used properly straight away.
Yeah.
Whereas if you have someone come to you and they're 18, say they play resis or they play a feeder club to a rugby team, I'm not going to spend a year trying to teach them how to clean. So after that year, I can load up the clean and get them more powerful.
Yeah.
I'm going to give them exercises they can be successful at straight away.
And I think the next slide is, and you guys, we've done a video on this, but these are the type of exercises that you can do to generate that power rate of force development within one session.
Yep.
Yeah.
I've spent not only my training career, but like coaching people, but my time lifting, I've spent around weightlifting and weightlifters. I competed in weightlifting for an amount of time. I don't use any of the Olympic lifts.
Yeah.
That's coming from someone who's proficient at them, has qualifications coaching them, has spent time interning under national, international level coaches. I just don't see the merit in them for sport.
Yeah. And it's very much, I've done the 2-day course in the level 1 weightlifting, and that was 2 8-hour days. Done a fair bit of weightlifting movements as well, and I would never coach it. I'm not at that level. So you almost need to do the course to realize how technical it is.
Yep.
Yeah. So again, somewhere you guys can explore more if you want to become weightlifting coaches. Okay, so a very popular way of trying to increase an athlete's power and a few different levels of the strength power curve is using the weightlifting competitive lifts. So you've got the clean and jerk and the snatch. So you'll see a lot of strength and conditioning coaches utilising these lifts and derivative lifts from the weightlifting environment. Graham and I both are in agreement that the lift itself it's very, very complicated and technical. So the value and the positive transfer into sport is limited, especially with athletes who haven't done much of it. So to become an efficient weightlifting athlete is a 5-6 year learning continuum spectrum. So it's very technical, and then if we're just trying to produce power in this athlete here, who's Graham's well trained in this, but if he wasn't, say he's a basketball athlete, there are alternative lifts that we can do. So we're going to show you the clean and jerk and the snatch for those people who are unfamiliar with these lifts, so that you can see how complicated they are. Graham's done about 8 to 10 years of this consistently, so it's quite a good technique. But I want you to just pay attention to how hard this would be to coach. We don't really teach this even when we are doing the practical shoots. We lead you towards the alternatives because of the main thing is intent. So to get power, or increases in power that will transfer into sport, we need to be able to get the person we're training to be able to do 100% effort. So they're going to be putting everything in, speed, effort, mentally there. And we're going to show you some lifts that Graham can do with a lower weight that don't have intent. And you'll remember from the theoretical side when we're talking about it, that the development of power is very much neuromuscular, and it's about motor unit recruitment. So if we're not doing it with high intent, we're not going to be producing any increases in power. So have a look at the technique here. So Graham's going to do a reasonably heavy clean and jerk, which is what we've got 80 kilos. You'll see how technical it is, and he's still not at maximum intent with 80 kilos because he can lift more than that. And then later down the track, we're going to show you some alternatives that you could do with your clients. So we'll get Graham to do just a single rep on a clean and jerk. As you can see, complicated, higher risk if you're not very proficient at it. You need a certain amount of space and noise requirements and stuff like that, so your general gyms won't allow that. More and more gyms are getting the facilities for this. But we can definitely use other mechanisms and exercises to improve this attribute of power. Anything you want to do?
No, not really. Highly technical lift. Take years of practice before you can actually express power in the lifts. Because they are so technical, there's a lot going on upstairs with the athlete about when and what they should be moving. So intent and speed and power are usually the last thing on their radar. Whereas if I can get an athlete to just jump with load, I can get the same stimulus.
So I think the take-home message is intent. So how long will it take me to coach a brand new athlete or client so we can get to 100% intent to improve our attribute that we're trying to improve. So remember, we're very much strategically planning programs. So we're trying to improve power. This could take 3 or 4 years to teach somebody who doesn't have full understanding of it. So there's definitely better mechanisms. As a conditioning tool, you'll see conditioning in certain fields of strength and conditioning now with the Olympic lifts. I'm of the opinion that if we're increasing local muscular endurance, and we're going to do a shoot on this, it doesn't really change anything physiologically different to if I'm doing other exercises that are safer. And we'll talk about that in the local muscular endurance shoot, but we're just increasing the client's ability to provide energy rapidly. So we could do, say we're just trying to produce it with his legs, we could do that on a bike, ring gates. And there is a bit of specificity in there, but we'll talk about that later. So we'll quickly set up a snatch. I'll turn the camera off. We'll set up a snatch. We'll show you that lift. It's even more complicated. I would consider it higher risk than the clean and press. And then we're going to show you some derivatives and then alternatives that we would prefer with a beginner client to get 100% intent. So just before we move into the snatch, we thought we'd add in just a quick example for you of Graham if he wasn't highly trained. So if he had decreased in intent, so he's going to attempt to do this at like sort of 65, 70%. It's going to be hard to show you, but you'll see, focus on the bar speed, focus on his triple extension, so that's his hip, knee, calf raise. So he's going to be in that full triple extension. How quickly he achieves that, his rate of force development, all those things, pay attention to that, the things that we'll talk about in the slides. And you'll see that we probably aren't going to get positive transfer into his, say, basketball jump from a lift that's performed like this. So, Graham will give us an example. This is higher risk too. So, you can see there the velocity was down, definitely didn't reach full triple extension. So I wouldn't expect that lift to improve his jumping ability or whatever we're trying to improve. And in fact, it's probably could potentially decrease performance. So show one at 60 to compare. Full and 10. Yeah, so let's show, that's a good idea. We'll show one at 60 kilos, full and 10. So you can see there, just by a quick glance, much faster, reaches full extension, much more power in the bar. Yeah, so you can see that the same lift, same weight can give us two different outcomes, depending on their ability. So again, we'll show the options for a beginner athlete, well not even beginner athlete, beginner to weightlifting athlete, why would we bother with this? Okay, so Graham's going to show us the power snatch. So what I want you to pay attention to is the mobility requirements that an athlete would need to complete this lift, especially since you guys have done FMS and that kind of mobility screen. You should be able to see the kind of things that attributes that he would require. I want you to look at how leverage would matter, so arm length, torso length, all those kind of components, how you think that would matter. Do you think that an athlete or a client would be hesitant to do this exercise? So, it may take 3 or 4 years before they're even willing to try it at a maximum of 10. And strain on certain joints. So I always was a bit fearful of my shoulder joints with this one, being a taller athlete, or wouldn't call myself an athlete. Anything else that I missed there at all?
No, not really. Intent is everything with power training. With weightlifting, throwing weight over your head, it can take a while to really want to come out of your shell and put a meaningful weight over your head to create stimulus. So it takes time.
Yeah. So Graham's just going to give us one rep, just so that for the people who've never actually really seen this lift, which I'm sure a few guys haven't really got into weightlifting too much, how technical and how much mobility requirements and those kind of components are. So if you look at it, like the bar's traveling with a little bit of an arc over his head, so he has to have the ability to stop there and not go over. And if you look at some of those CrossFit fail videos, I've seen guys pop their shoulders out behind. So that's why I was always sus on that lift. Again, we're developing essentially mainly leg power. There's a fairly solid back component to it as well, but we're going to show you now some other lifts that you can do to still generate that power, maximum of 10, and we can do it in the first training session rather than taking 3 or 4 years.
So these are the alternatives to power and triple extension training that Dave and I prefer to the Olympic lifts, purely because there's much less of a learning curve to these lifts and I can get the stimulus needed for power out of my athletes straight away. So the first one would simply just be a loaded jump. With any weighted dumbbell that your athlete is comfortable with, it's as simple as jumping. That takes about a minute to get the feel of and get used to, and we can create overload in our jumping patterns and triple extension nearly straight away. Moving on from the dumbbell jump, we can progress to a trap bar jump. This is something we'd move to when we're looking for higher load in the jump, to look a little bit further up the force velocity curve. And we're going to be less limited by how the dumbbells move, and we can add some significant weight to the trap bar. And it's as simple as from starting here, bend, jump. And lastly, one of our end stage progressions for triple extension training would be something like a clean pull. So now we're moving closer to the Olympic lifts, but the technical proficiency has much less demand. It is a bit more technical than the trap bar, purely because it is a fixed plane with the bar. The weight cannot move around my center of mass, the bar will always be in front. So we're getting a lot more quad activation and triple extension.
Okay, so obviously this isn't an exhaustive list of power exercises. We're just trying to give you a little taste so that you can go and explore more. There's hips, plyometrics, hips, or these type of alternative lifts. We thought we'd show you a couple of upper body, pretty much all push throw type exercises to generate some power. So the traditional landline press that you guys are used to, we can turn that into a power development exercise if I throw it. So if I just explode and then grab and catch it. So it's actually pretty easy to catch. It's scary, it sounds scarier than it is, but it will slow down as I jam that out for grab and catch. We can do, I'm sure you guys have seen the throw, so if I was going to throw, I could just do a single arm throw, put a little bit of support there, and then I carry it in. That's 8 kilos, so you know, you've got to think about your own safety as the coach, so Graham's got to be safe as well. Throw it in, and if we can do a supine throw, just Graham has the ball. I can just absorb the force, press out, bit slow there. So again, just a quick sample of how we can generate power without complicated exercises. So I haven't trained in that for years now, but I could go 100% intent within a minute. So as you can see, the value of these for somebody who's not trained and a competitive weightlifter is high. Anything else upper body wise?
No, intent is key with all power. So give your athlete exercises where they can perform.
Okay guys, so talking about strength. So when we say that, we're talking absolute strength in this shoot. So we've got a couple of options of how to train and then try and improve strength. So it's very much a sets and reps scheme adjustment for strength, and then there's no sort of one perfect program. It's how you program over a long period of time. Strength athletes don't peak till late 20s, like 28 sort of time, even longer, like 30s. Yeah.
In weightlifting, most athletes peak at 33.
Yeah, and I think you see the power guys, they compete well into their 40s.
Yeah.
So strength, absolute strength is one of the sort of the last things you lose as physically, or starts to decrease. But speed definitely starts going in that sort of later 20s, 30s, and that's why you see the athletes in those field-based sports, that's about the time they have to retire. So keeping that in mind, that it's not about this is the best program ever. It's about your long-term planning to improve strength. So some sets and rep schemes that you can use. You can do contrast complex training, which is where we're trying to take advantage of the post-activation potentiation mechanism. Most of the time you'll just read it as PAP because it's very hard to say. And that's where we'll go and we'll do our heavy compound lift. So usually 1 up to 5 reps at about 80%. That depends on what the rep range you've selected. So if you're at 1, you're definitely higher than that. We'll rest 2 to 8 minutes. So we're trying to get recovery in the energy system, a little bit of recovery in the neural system, and then we'll go do like a plyometric style exercise. So we're doing something unloaded with high velocity, and it's a similar movement pattern usually. So you might do a squat to a box jump, and we'll show you that, and you're doing similar reps usually as well. So that PAP mechanism has been shown to be still improve performance up to sort of 15 minutes with some athletes, but generally you're sort of looking at that 8 minutes is probably good, and just like being able to program and wait 15 minutes is just way too long as well. But they do use that in sport, so you'll hear about guys maybe doing a heavy lift before they go out and do a sprint event. So they've primed the neuromuscular system before going out and do some sprints. So whether they've got the facilities to do that in the sheds is a different story, but you do hear about it. Another one we're going to show you is cluster sets. So this is, the thinking behind cluster sets is to build strength endurance, so you can show your maximum strength over more reps and for longer periods of time. It's also to try and increase the total load of a session. So how that works is, say I'm going to do a lift, I'll do 3 reps, pause for a second, a few seconds, allow some recovery, and then do 3 reps again. But we would have been lifting a load that I would have only been able to do 5 reps on. So essentially I achieved 6 in that set on a load that I could only achieve 5 on. And there's a few different ways to do that, and you can see that there on the slide, 3 + 1 + 1 + 1, or 2 + 2. So definitely something to explore. And then the other option we're going to show you is just a traditional strength type exercise where I just do, 5 reps, controlled eccentric phase, had a 3-minute rest, came back and did a 5 rep with controlled eccentric phase. So that's your sort of traditional strength training set and rep scheme as well. Okay, so we're going to show you a couple of sets and rep schemes to building strength. Like I've said in some of the other things, it's not an exhaustive list. If you're going to get interested in it, there's a lot of research you can do. So the first one I'm just going to show you to give you a foundation is what we do if we're doing a strength session on the front squat. And this is just a traditional type set structure. So I'm going to come in, I'm going to do my set, and then I'm going to have a rest period, and we'll talk about what you can do and what, depending on your load in that period. So the programming we wrote was I'm going to do 2 sets, 5 reps. My tempo will be, I'm going to go 4 down, 1 up, and so it's a 4-0-1-0. And we're going to have a 3-minute rest. So Graham's over there, he's going to time me to get exact 3 minutes, just so that you can get a feel of how long that would actually take if I was having a passive 3-minute rest. I'm going to talk to you during it so you're not super bored. If I run out of things to say, I'll stop and fast forward a bit, but just so you get an awareness and a feeling for this type of programming. So this would be up, just below power if we've done some power work. The second sort of programming rule that we discussed last week would be pure strength training, because it's very much a anaerobic ATP, CP or PC system exercise, and it's very neuromuscular, strength based. So, all right, here we go, 5 reps. So 3 minutes is on. So as you can see, even though it's only 5 reps and I have that pretty light, due to the tempo, my heart rate's up and I've got a little bit of fatigue there. So there's a few options, a few trains of thought around the rest. If I was a powerlifter and that was really heavily loaded, I would have a full passive rest, so I would just sit. Somebody who maybe isn't moving the total absolute amount of weight, it may be valuable to do some mobility work. So for someone like me, I have dorsiflexion restriction, and that's why I use plates under my heels. Long shanks, not great dorsiflexion. I need that to actually do a nice technique. So I could potentially do some knee to wall work, but you want to make sure that you don't blunt the reflexive stuff like the stretch reflex. So you got to be very careful on that. I could do maybe some upper body mobility work, so thoracic spine, so that limits the squat if you've got a really kyphotic spine. So I could be doing some work there as well in this break. And then things that were completely unrelated. We could be working some technique drill and passing or something, but it's going to be you'll be very careful that it doesn't impact on the strength component here. So again, if the load's high and the intent's high, I'll be going more towards the passive. If somebody's got lots of restrictions, I'll be doing some mobility work that doesn't impact their strength, and then you're going to be very strategic with it, because if this was 140 kilos and I was maxing out here, not that I can probably lift that anymore, but you know, even the dorsiflexion stuff could impact my lift here.
That's 2 minutes.
2 minutes, so we've still got another minute. The only other things that we could probably talk about is, you know, you may want to coach that technique a little in between, so you can talk about the points. So to fill that room, you can talk about whether I need to drive my knees forward a little bit. You could be filming if you're working with an athlete and showing them the film. So there's a lot of things you can do, but as you can see, 3 minutes is quite a long time. So PT clients, you probably need to also keep them a little more engaged, because they don't really want to pay you for 3 minutes of sitting around. Athletes are more likely to be happy to sit around, so judge it by your subject as well. How are we going there? 10 seconds? Yeah. So that's about 3 minutes there, so I can get my athlete to jump in now. I'm fully recovered, my creatine's recovered, that takes 3 to 5 minutes, so I'll be pretty close to fully there. No. So as you can see, that was 2 sets, probably 5 to 6 minutes in total after setup and stuff like that. So that's the one we're talking about last week, is the session flow and timing. You literally need 3 to 5 minutes rest for a strength type activity, if that was heavily loaded. So just keep that in the back of your mind. Okay, so the next set and rep structure I wanted to show you is contrast or complex training. So they can be, those terms can be used pretty much synonymously, hard word to say. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do 3 reps of squats. I'm going to use sort of 2 3-second down, 1 second explosion out, and then I'm going to do 3 sets of that, and then I'll move to a box jump for 3 seconds straight afterwards. You can vary the rest breaks in that depending on what you want to achieve. For the purpose of this tutorial, I'm going to go straight into it. And because the reps are low, so I'm not creating too much fatigue. So what the goal is here is we talk about sort of neural priming. So if I go into a heavier lift, and usually this is loaded pretty heavy, then my motor units have been engaged, and we're going to bypass, well not bypass, but accelerate the recruitment of the Henneman's principle, which we have discussed in the slides. So I'm going to recruit more fibers more quickly. We always have to recruit in the order that we discussed, but that happens more rapidly. So we're getting more of those bigger motor units quicker in your jumps. And you'll see that when you do this kind of training, that you'll actually produce more power. Then there's other things like just on more alert, all the psychology stuff, but down in the motor unit, we're just recruiting faster. So back squat, 3 reps. And then you've got up to 15 minutes to do a power exercise. I think optimally it's about 10 minutes, so you can allow your athlete to recover. Creatine stores recover, ATP stores recover, which you guys will talk more about in physiology, but that quickly replenishes. We've got that neural priming effect, we can see that up to 15 minutes, but you have to experiment with your athlete to find out the recovery period that suits them best, because it's individual. And then I'll jump into 3 plyometric exercises. And then I'll have a longer rest there. So when I was passive, doing some fillers, but I might have 5 minutes rest before I do that again to have full recovery. Okay, so the next rep scheme that I'm going to show you is the cluster set scheme. So the thinking behind that is to increase the total volume in a strength session. So we're working on sort of strength endurance, our ability to produce max force in more reps. So what they do and there's many ways to do this. I've chosen to show you a 3 + 1 + 1 + 1 + 1. So I'm going to be doing, 7 reps. Generally what we do is we'd load that to a 6 rep level, so it's slightly heavier than what I would be able to do for 7 reps. And then I have small incremental breaks after the 3, so that's what +1s are. So I may just have 10 seconds rest, allow some restoring of ATP and creatine phosphate, and it allows me to do it that extra rep that I wouldn't be able to do if I was just doing 7 straight on that 6 rep load. So you have to play around with your figures, you need to know your athlete and work out what load they'll be working at. But how we do it, if I came into deadlifts is a great exercise to be able to do it in. I'm going to come in, set up, do my first 3. Then I can start my +1s, so I might have 5 to 10 seconds rest. First +1. Have a little rest period. +1. Quick little rest. And it only has to be short because the recovery is quite rapid. +1. Little rest, last one. So this is a rep I wouldn't be able to do if I was doing my 6 rep load. But because I've allowed some recovery of that system, I can get a little bit of extra volume in that session at that weight, or in that rep and that set. So it's very good for providing a novel stimulus for strength trained athletes when we're trying to increase total strength and their ability to produce that strength and more repetitions. Okay guys, moving more into the plyometrics component now. So again, start thinking about the non-contractile elements where it's the stretch shorten cycle, so we definitely need some pre-stretch to maximize the potential of this training. So the first thing we're going to teach you is landing mechanics. So you definitely need to, your athlete needs to show you that they can land correctly. So, most of do you have any junior athletes?
Yeah.
So how long would you sort of spend on this, do you reckon?
Months and months and months.
Yeah.
I've spent 6 months with athletes learning to land before I've even taught them to jump.
Yeah.
The saying I like is that you wouldn't learn how to fly a plane before you knew how to land it.
Yeah.
So you wouldn't put your athletes in a position to be jumping really high if they don't know how to land safely and absorb that load.
Yeah, so it's very important. You're going to have to work on that athlete buy-in that Graham sort of was explaining there as well, because it can be probably a little boring at 6 months, but the injury prevention, longevity type benefits from that would be huge.
Yeah, there's plenty of different ways to do it. I think there's one that we've filmed that's pretty fun, so you can definitely keep it novel.
Yeah, yeah. So then you've also got to be thinking, we don't always land on 2 legs, so we have to train that with 1 leg as well. So you'd start with bilateral, and then we'll show you the progression of this, and this is 1 progression, all right? So never get sort of regimented in anything we say, guys. And then we'll show you a couple of unilateral options as well, so landing 1 leg. Then what we start doing is we start working on bilateral for height or distance, and then unilateral for height and distance, and then bilateral continuous, so that's sort of like bounding or hurdles, and then unilateral continuous, so we're doing that on single leg. One of the key points here, guys, is somebody may be up to bilateral continuous, but still on unilateral in-place landing mechanics. So you don't have to follow that completely, because some people might be a bit weaker on the unilateral motor control type stuff.
Yeah, it should be treated more like a spectrum, more so than a progression and regression list.
Yeah, so don't be super strict on it, I think is the main point there. And plyometrics are very valuable for like your elderly athletes and stuff like that as well. So I think we mentioned that in another shoot, we use plyometrics to increase bone mineral density, tendon strength, all that kind of stuff. So don't just think, young athletes. When you implement it with older athletes, you have to just be a bit more careful, maybe give them stability so they're holding onto a wall. But and another thing that I just thought of then, the rate of force development is very associated with falls as well. So if we do plyometrics training, we will reduce falls, which have a very poor outcome of health with elderly. So if we can improve someone's rate of force development at 60, 70 plus, we may actually extend their life because they won't have that traumatic fall, break their femur, have all the complications with that. So not only are you increasing bone mineral density, but you also reduce falls. So it's definitely got a clinical place as well. Don't just think athletes only for plyometrics. Probably the most complicated part of plyometric is trying to manage the load. So it's still very much a feeling, sort of art type thing as well. There's some stuff that we've implemented or research has shown. We do things like we watch the vertical jump and power measures as we talked about. But it's still very hard as a coach to still follow it. So generally what we do is we just count foot contacts. So if they do 3 jumps bilateral, that's 3 contacts.
Yeah, because plyometrics usually dictated by a short ground contact time. I think the literature says for it to be plyometric, it has to be 0.6 of a second that your foot is on contact with the ground. So for you to exert force to jump in 0.6 of a second is really high force.
Yeah.
So it's very high load and quite fatiguing, and there's a lot of stimulus on the body.
Yeah.
So you have to be conservative in how many plyometric exercises we do.
So you guys, when we're doing the tempo and the counting last time, if you're writing a plyometric program, you would actually count the contacts as well. If I go over the next slide here, we will do a multiplier for a single leg landing, so times by 2. But then you've also, where it gets hard is, are we doing depth jumps? A higher depth jump would be more of a load than just a off the ground jump. So, again, it's a way that we can manage load and record load, but I wouldn't call it perfect. So just be aware of that, and then, just because one athlete can do 30 contacts, the other one might be able to do 60 and vice versa.
Yeah, plyometrics is very much about load through the tendon more so than the muscle.
Yeah.
And it's very easy to overcook it and not so much tear a tendon, but you can do micro damage, and that can accumulate very quickly if you're doing too many contacts per session.
Yeah.
Essentially what we're looking at for plyometrics is how fast we can load a tendon and release that energy. If you think of the muscle being the base of the slingshot and the string of the slingshot being the tendon, we're looking for muscle stiffness. So say your calf needs to be able to stiffen so your Achilles can load up that energy and then release. So a lot of those efforts over and over and over again will accumulate a lot of fatigue and a lot of micro trauma to the tendon.
So then you're kind of thinking like the band's getting little splits, and you guys have probably all seen that. That slingshot was a really good metaphor for it. And then so you get the band itself getting those little micro tears that you do see in the bands in the gym.
Yep.
If you don't allow that to recover, snap.
It might take months, but if you keep at it, it'll happen.
Yeah. And I've put a link in there, guys, that I found. I'll have to get Dale to post it separately for you, but Strength of Science had a really good picture to explain that.
Like a progression.
Yeah, so have a look at that as well. That makes it a lot more simple. No. Okay, so here what we've done is we've created a video sequence of how we would progress people along the plyometrics learning stages, and there's also the protocol for determining the plyo box height for your athletes. So I'll be just talking over the video and we'll go from here. So the first important part of teaching plyometrics is you have to start teaching landing mechanics. So what we can do here, we've got Graham doing tall drops with a catch. So he started before with the double leg catch. I'll just quickly go back to that for you. So you can see he's going up nice and tall and jams his arms down to create some downward force. And then we're just working on his landing mechanics here. So his knees are in line with his toes. It's coming through the hips. So he's learning how to absorb force in landing. Then we progress to single leg. So you can see it's not very dynamic. We can create a stimulus that challenges it. And he's learning how to land. Then the next progression from there is we add a small jump with the landing catch phase. So you can see we've got a little extra force now of gravity. So his tendons are being loaded, but he's learning the mechanics there. And then we've progressed to a single leg version here. So we're challenging that stability. Then we move on to a small depth drop. So we're going double leg and single leg. So we start with double leg, progress to single leg. So now we're getting much more tendon loading because we're at a higher level. So we've got the force of gravity or the acceleration of gravity on that landing. And as you can see here, this would be the pretty intense for a new person if you're trying to teach them to land on a single leg. So you got to take your time and build confidence around landing. Landing, then you can start making it more interesting. So here we've got a little bounce to create a little bit, this is very sport specific now. So basketball, AFL, those kind of sports, you get pushed around. So we're teaching Graham to land when his force is changing direction mid-air. It's also a good tool for end stage rehabilitation. So creating confidence and having him aware of and ready to go. This is the protocol in your shoot notes of how to determine the start point of plyometrics depth jumping for your athlete client, whoever you're going to work with. So you guys have seen the Vertec in at least intro to sports science, but you've probably done it in biomechanics and stuff like that as well. So you guys know the protocol there. We figure out the height and then we're going to work out the difference, and that'll be his actual vertical displacement. So we do 3 attempts here to figure out his base level height or vertical jump. So we've got 3 quick attempts here with Graham. You can do a full counter movement jump and we just determine his height. So this is his 3 attempts that we did. He's got a decent little jump there. Then what we do for males, we start at 24, and I'll just pause the video quickly. So, because that was pretty quick. So at the first stage for a male athlete is 24 inches. I think that was 64 centimeters or something like that. And then we have to look for if he gets the same height as his stationary jump. And then if he has achieved the same level or better, because we're going to get more tendon loading, remember? So if he has the ability to transfer that stretch into the jump, he may jump higher. And that's the point of the depth jumps, is we're creating that ability to use that elastic energy. Then we can progress, so we add on the 6-inch box or 15 centimeters. And then we continue doing that till the point where we reach no more improvement or less improvement. So he doesn't have the capability to transfer that force quickly enough to increase his height. So we've got that stretch shorten cycle happening. And then at the point where we're no longer getting a benefit from the stretch phase, then what we do is that's the height that we'll work at, or we can even come back a little bit to ensure that we're getting that quality over quantity. And then we can retest maybe a couple of blocks later to see if we can work off higher boxes. For untrained people or more clinical or elderly, I would usually start maybe a little bit lower. So I might use the 6-inch box to start and then progress them up to that. So this protocol is very much for younger sort of athletic populations. It's very important that you do this correctly because you could have a negative transfer if you have a too high a box and his speed slows down because of the absorption phase. Okay, then we're going to move into actual plyometrics. So you can see here, we're just starting with the basic box jump. You can see that He's having rest, he's not rushing through it. It's not a conditioning tool. We've given you a few different angles here. He's still working on his landing mechanics, and we're looking at maximum power output. So we don't necessarily need a very high box. We're just instructing our athlete client to jump as high as they possibly can with good technique. And we want it to be as quick as possible. So you can see different angles here. He's getting plenty of rest, and we're just getting as much power as possible. Next progression would be single leg. This is actually very difficult, so you don't need a very high box. You can see here, the sticking the landing is quite important as well, so you need to correct mechanics, and he's just progressing. As your athlete gets better at that, we can move to the depth jump. So I've given you a few different angles here, and I've kept the transition in so I've got time to speak to you. But you can see he's got a little bit of extra overload or force because of gravity, and then he's going to transfer that quickly into the box jump. So what we've done here as well is we've shown you the slow versus fast. So it's very important that these are done fast. So I'll just go back for you and see this is a slow one. So he would lose energy, the stored energy there in the slow ones. That's fast, that's slow. So if there is any delay in that depth jump, the energy will be no longer stored in the tendon and it will be dissipated as heat. So it's very important that we move very quickly. And it's merely split second, 6 milliseconds I think it was that we were discussing. Then we progress to single leg there. So you can see he's got maximum intent. Changing angles, we're going to look at the landing mechanics. So watch his knees and ankles. These are the things you're looking for coaching. So all that force, drive, good landing. Again, it's very fast. I've got a view here of his foot and ankle. And again, it's all about intent and moving quickly. So this is very much a progression for the double leg. It's quite hard. Then what we can move is into more dynamic, continuous activities. So I would consider this one, the kangaroo jump, is probably level 1. Then we move on to a hurdle style jump. So we've got more height, a little bit more risk there. This is just a different angle so you can watch his landing mechanics. So he's still working on his landing. Going to alternating legs, a little bit of lateral loading there. And then probably the most difficult is single leg. This isn't an exhaustive list of exercises you can do, but it's just to get you guys thinking about the progressions of plyometrics. So we have to start bilateral, go to single leg, in a static, moving towards bilateral single leg in that more continuous dynamic. And that link that I had on the PowerPoint there has a good flow chart for you guys to follow.
Okay guys, I thought I'd just quickly go over the progression for programming, looking from our program from last week where we wrote a volume or hypertrophy program, and just showing how that would flow into strength and then strength and power or just power. So we can see in the yellow highlighted cells that we've progressed the back squat from more 3x8 volume style training to more strength ranges with a 4x5. You can see that the tempo have changed to a more traditional 2-0-2-0 and much larger rest periods. We can see that the landmine press has progressed to a push press, which is much more powerful in the lower body. The rep scheme reflects a bit more power training with a 2-0-1-0. And we can see that the single leg RDL, which we were doing more lower rep for some stability, we've changed back to hypertrophy rep ranges just so we can maintain some of the training volume that we accumulated through the hypertrophy phase. One of the big things we need to keep in mind is once we go to a strength phase doesn't mean we completely rule out all of the volume hypertrophy training we've done. We should always have some small element of our last phase into the next phase. So we can see moving from the strength phase in the strength and power, the exercises haven't necessarily changed greatly, maybe just small progressions. So the back squat remains the same. The rep schemes change from a 4x5 to a 3x4. The tempo has changed to 1 second, so this is much more explosive, probably a lot lower load, but focusing on power. Landmine push press has progressed to a landmine throw. Again, much lower load, higher velocity, definitely more power training based. And we can see that the barbell RDL that we use to keep some volume in our training program has now progressed to a trap bar deadlift, which has more of a strength training profile. And that's to maintain a lot of the strength that we accumulated in our last phase. So if we wanted to later in this program or even in an alternate day, we could add some more hypertrophy volume style stuff to keep that accumulation of volume. With a more advanced athlete or client, say someone with a bit more of a training age, someone who's performed power and strength training a little bit more, we can add some more high velocity, highly neurally depleting exercises to the start of their program. So let's say for this person, we're going to add in a depth jump, and we would make sure that's at the top of their program while they're freshest. They've just performed a warm up, they're neurally ready to perform, and they haven't had a whole lot of tendon loading and muscle loading yet in their session. So for today, we'll go a depth jump, and that would be anything from 3 to 4 sets to maybe 4 to 6 reps. And that could either be performed on its own or with someone a bit more advanced. We could superset that with the back squat. And that without changing our accessory exercises like our cable rows, wall walks, ab rollout. This is just a quick way to look at the progression of how programs would transition from a volume to a strength power. We see that exercises don't have to change greatly. We don't have to have a whole new set of exercises for each program. What matters is the sets, reps, tempos, our rest periods, because that's how we elicit the response and get the intent of movement that we want to get out of our client or athlete.
So that's it for the shoot, guys. Just the main take home, I think, for strength and power is that the amount of recovery you need and it's quality over quantity. Would you agree with that? Any
Totally.
more that you think? Or?
No, not really. I think you nailed it there. Usually be conservative and make sure that you're getting intent out of your client or athlete. This is the kind of stuff where if we half bake it, we're not going to get the adaptation we need.
Yeah. And I think the only other thing would be you're always looking for a positive transfer into whatever you're training for. So you got to have that in the back of your mind. Will this improve what I'm trying to improve? So quality over quantity, and recovery time is number one, and then will it improve the performance? Be conservative, and it's long-term planning. We're not trying to make somebody the world champion high jumper in 3 sessions.
No, we're not trying to add 50 kilos on a deadlift in 1 cycle.
No.